Hello everyone, we will study the cerebellum in the control of movement. The cerebellum, or little brain, lies caudal to the occipital lobe and is attached to the posterior aspect of the brainstem through three paired fiber threads: the inferior, middle, and the superior cerebellar peduncles. Input to the cerebellum comes from peripheral sensory receptors, the brainstem and the cerebral cortex. The inferior, middle, and to a lesser degree, superior cerebellar peduncles carry the input. The output projections are mainly, if not totally, to other motor control areas of the central nervous system and are mostly carried in the superior cerebral peduncles. The cerebellum contains three pairs of intrinsic nuclei: the vestigial, interposed, and dentate. In some classification schemes, the interposed nucleus is further divided into emboliform and globose nuclei. The cerebellar surface is arranged in multiple parallel longitudinal folds termed folia. Several deep fissures divided the cerebellum into three main morphological components: the anterior, posterior, and flocculonodular lobes, which also corresponding with the functional subdivision of the cerebellum. The functional division are the vestibulocerebellum, the spinal cerebellum, and the cerebral cerebellum. These divisions appear in sequence during evolution. The lateral cerebellar hemisphere increases in size along with expansion of the cerebral cortex. The three divisions have similar intrinsic security. Thus, the function of each depends on the nature of the output nucleus to which it projects. The vestibulocerebellum is composed of the flocculonodular lobe. It receives input from the vestibular system and the visual areas. Output goes to the vestibular nucleus, which can, in a sense, be considered as an additional pair of intrinsic cerebellar nuclei. The vestibulocerebellum functions to control equilibrium and eye movements. The medially placed spinal cerebellum consists of the midline vermis plus the medial portion of the lateral hemisphere, called the intermediate zones. Spinal cerebellar pathway carrying somatic sensory information terminate in the vermis and intermediate zones in somatotopic arrangements. The auditory, the visual, and vestibular system and the sensory motor cortex also project to his portion of cerebellum. Output from the vermis is directed to the vestiginal nuclei, which project through the inferior cerebellar peduncle to the vestibular nuclei and the reticular formation of the pons and medulla. Output from the intermediate zone goes to the interposed nuclei and from this to the red nucleus, and ultimately to the motor cortex, where the vitrolateral nucleus of the thalamus. It is believed that both the vestigial and the interposed nuclei contain a complete representation of the muscles of the body. The vestigial output system controls anti-gravity muscles in posture and locomotion, while the interposed nuclei perhaps act on stretch reflexes and other somatosensory reflexes. The cerebellum occupies the lateral aspect of the cerebellar hemispheres. Input comes exclusively from the cerebral cortex, relayed through the middle cerebellar peduncles of the pons. The cortical areas that are prominent in motor control are the source for most of this input. Output is directed to the dentate nuclei, and from there, where the ventrolateral thalamus back to the motor and the premotor cortex. Lesions reveal the functions of the cerebellum. Lesions of the cerebellum produce impairment in the coordinated action of agonists, antagonists, and synergists. This impairment is clinically known as ataxia. The control of limb, axial, and cranial muscles may be impaired depending on the site of the cerebellar lesion. Limb ataxia might manifest as the cross-jerking motion of an arm and hand during reaching for an object, instead of the expected smooth actions. This jerking type of motion is also referred to as action tremor. The swaying walk of an intoxicated individual is a vivid example for tranquil ataxia. Cerebellar lesions can also produce a reduction in muscle tone, hypotonia. This condition is manifest as a notable decrease in the low level of resistance to passive joint movement, detectable in normal relaxed individuals. Myotactic reflexes produced by tapping a tendon with a reflex hammer reverberate for several cycles. Because of impaired timing from the reduced muscle tone. The hypotonia is likely a result of impaired processing of cerebellar afferent action potentials from the muscle spindles and the Golgi tendon organs. While this lesion establishes a picture of the absence of cerebellar function, we are left without a firm idea of what the cerebellum does in the normal state. Cerebellar function is sometimes described as comparing the intended with the actual movement and adjusting motor system output in ongoing movement. Other putative functions include a role in learning new motor and even cognitive skills. That's all for this class. Thank you. See you.